Welcome to the Urban Legends Hotline, where we investigate the mysterious tales of your hometowns and the cryptic stories that passed through the lockered halls of your schools to get to the haunted heart of the urban legends you grew up hearing and maybe even telling. Today we are covering the Hippie Babysitter Baby Roast. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and from one friend of a friend to another, this is American Hysteria.
So when I was a teenager in the 90s, my entire economy was built through babysitting. So I babysat for families at church, my teachers, everyone. It's the way I earned money to buy a car. And an urban legend that I heard was that once in a few towns over, there was a girl who was babysitting for a family she regularly babysat for, but she let her boyfriend come over, I guess, and hang out, and he brought drugs. I don't know what drugs, but, drugs. And they did the drugs, and then they went about their business babysitting. So the girl put the chicken in the oven that the mom asked her to do for dinner, and she put the baby to bed, and she got her boyfriend out the door so she could, normalize herself before the mom returned. And legend has it that when the mom got home, she asked how everything went, and the babysitter replied it went great. And the mom said good. She checked on the baby, and in the bassinet there was a raw chicken wrapped up in blankets. And so the mom rushed downstairs and discovered the babysitter put the baby in the oven. So I heard this story a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different times, usually about drugs. I wonder how true it is. Is it true?
Our dear listener, Sarita, has dealt out a dark, psychedelic folktale, one that I've been hoping someone would dose me with since we started the Urban Legends Hotline. Known in contemporary folklore studies as either the Hippie Babysitter or the Baby Roast, this tale is an absolute classic that has remained popular since its inception in the 1960s. As a kid, I certainly heard it in the late 90s, and every time I did, I heard the most common version, that the hallucinogenic LSD was the specific substance that our unintentionally murderous teen was blasted on. Though Sarita's version tells of that raw chicken found in the crib, the original versions use a turkey as the unbaked bird. In other versions, when the story leaves out the baby raw poultry crib switcheroo, the mother calls to check on the babysitter and is told about the turkey dinner, realizing with some confusion that she didn't leave any such turkey in her kitchen. Rushing home, she realizes with horror what the babysitter, in her LSD stupefaction, has done. Rarely, the mother gets there just in time to save the baby, but almost always, that baby is basted up, roasted to a golden brown, and ready to carve. When tracing the origins of this urban legend, we can see that it began to appear in newspaper articles by 1970, but those stories are all attempting to debunk the then common rumor. So we can safely assume that the legend had been going around before then, likely for a handful of years. I believe that the legend transformed into the version we know today by 1968, after periodic national outrage about the moral decline of the American teenage girl and the moral bankruptcy of the modern American woman, and after 2 years of an LSD drug panic that put the hippie generation in its crosshairs. In the mid-60s, several other LSD tall tales began to appear, and along with our hippie babysitter, we'll be looking at one known as the Orange Man, an acid-dropping hippie who came to believe he was an orange permanently. Along with these bits of acid lore, a term used for LSD-related urban legends, we're going to look at some older tales that involve shady young caregivers and the children in their care, and discuss the underlying morals of the story and what they have to say about the unprecedented arrival of the love generation.
Don't you like this eye-level oven broiler with its big picture window? Because it's gas, it seals in juiciness and flavor while it broils, and it bakes beautifully. First, your roast is cooked perfectly, and your roast is kept moist and juicy for hours if necessary, never overcooked or dried out. Remember, for clean, modern cooking, gas makes the big difference.
When examining our legend today, contemporary folklorists like Jan Brunvand have written about an earlier, rampant rumor that likely contributed to the hippie babysitter baby roast. He collected oral testimonials from people who had heard this urban legend stretching back into the 1920s, usually referred to now as the harried babysitter or the clever babysitter. The tale goes like this. A person is sitting on a bus or a park bench and overhears a conversation between two young nannies. They're talking about the ways they get their infant charges to stop crying and get to sleep. One says to the other something like, "It's simple. All you gotta do is turn on the gas and put the baby's head into the oven. All it takes is a few minutes and they fall fast asleep." Sometimes the story is told a little differently, with the mother returning home early to find the nanny putting the baby's head into the gas-filled oven. She defends herself by saying, "Well, this is always how I get the little darling to fall asleep." In the post-World War I economic and cultural boom of the 1920s, middle-class parents had more cash and more free time than ever before, and many wanted to do things like go out dancing and go to the movies, maybe hit a jazz club or speakeasy, and join the rockin' national party that was the Roaring Twenties. New methods of birth control were introduced in the same decade, which meant that families were having fewer children and there were fewer older siblings to care for their younger brothers and sisters. It was also becoming far less common for grandparents to live with or even near their grandkids, so parents needed to hire someone, sometimes even a stranger, to take care of their young children. This new parental lifestyle of fun and frivolity was frowned upon by older generations who saw the new entertainment culture as a kind of assault on hardworking Christian values and the nuclear family. It makes sense then that morality tales would become part of the language used to address these massive changes, and it makes sense that the young nanny would become a sinister symbol for this new lack of parental attention. At the same time, changing child labor laws and the new disposable income of the middle class culminated in the invention of a whole new class of citizen, the American teenager. And the American teenage girl became the most popular mini-mother to call upon when the baby needed sittin'. 2 decades later, these teenage babysitters became a necessary fixture of the World War II years, as many mothers in America were fulfilling their Rosie the Riveter wartime duty, working the jobs left behind by the millions of men drafted into battle. Soon, these same teenage girls became the center of a new moral panic about Bobby Soxers, the nickname for a swooning, screaming subculture that obsessed over Frank Sinatra and Elvis in the 40s and 50s. They rioted outside of concerts, lusted after soldiers on leave, and began demanding a new kind of personal freedom outside of their prescribed futures as mothers and homemakers. The outrage over this challenge to the established order produced popular low-budget educational films like Where Are Your Children?, Delinquent Daughters, Youth Runs Wild, and Youth Aflame, which painted this girl generation as one of society's most pressing menaces.
What's that?
Something that goes boom, boom, boom. You wouldn't want to hear it, would you?
Put that gun away. You're a very foolish young girl to make a move like this.
Newsweek went a little overboard when they wrote in March of 1944,
"The gravest tragedy of the war was the moral breakdown among American girls."
Newspaper articles specifically warned about hiring Bobby Soxers to watch young children, and it was during this time that the harried babysitter legend started up all over again. Folklorist Ernest Warren Bauman took down an oral retelling of the story in 1953. It went like this.
"In New York City, you have to be awfully careful about getting babysitters. You just don't know what might happen. My sister's girlfriend was sitting in the subway one day when she heard two women discussing the kids they stay with and how they handle them. She heard one of them say, 'I just take them into the kitchen and give them all a little bit of gas. You know, that could be very dangerous. No, you can't trust everybody with your children.'"
It was in March of the same year that the first newspaper articles appeared in which police were actively searching for these two chattering babysitters who told their special secret a little too loudly. This story is out of Boston and was wired to papers in almost every state.
"Police so far have been unsuccessful in finding the teenage babysitter who said she used gas to quiet a baby. It was reported to police that a teenager was overheard saying to a friend that she had no trouble getting her homework done on a babysitting job because she put the baby to sleep for the night by holding the infant's face over a gas jet."
These two thoughtless babysitters were never located by police, and it's very likely that whoever reported them was simply repeating a rumor that had been going around now for 20 years. Interestingly, tales that hold similar themes to the hippie babysitter have also existed in other regions of the world for at least 100 years, and may have been another influence on the story. For example, in Papua New Guinea, a version was recorded in 1910 that went like this. A mother makes a request of her oldest daughter to go and check on her infant brother and make sure he is hot enough. Instead of finding a blanket, she opens the door of the oven and places the baby inside. Another legend appeared in the late 1940s in Buenos Aires, Argentina, with versions collected by psychoanalyst Mary Langer. Also considered a true tale to the many who passed it on, there were no drugs involved, but instead a healthy dose of random insanity. The indulgent young parents of a newborn son head out to a frivolous night at the movies, asking their longtime servant to babysit for the evening. When they return home, however, the servant is dressed in the mother's white wedding gown and announces that she has a special surprise for them, gesturing to the dining room. What they see when they enter is beyond horrific. Their newborn on a platter, baked like a chicken, surrounded by roasted potatoes. At the sight, the mother immediately goes insane herself, becoming a mute for the rest of her life. The father pulls out a gun, shoots the servant, and disappears, never to be seen again. More after this. And now, back to the show.
The aggressive determination of hippies to start a new society has made its mark upon San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury. Most of these people are young. Most of them come from middle-class homes. The movement appears to be growing. Use of drugs appears to be spreading. there is the real danger that more and more young people may follow the call to turn on, tune in, drop out.
By the 1960s, when our urban legend was forming, the new teen moral panic surrounded the hippies, who were outraging their suburban parents with their dirty-footed rejection of conservative societal norms. They were trading them for a hodgepodge spirituality, sexual permissiveness, and radical anti-war, pro-civil rights politics, all seemingly fueled by marijuana and a new, baffling kind of drug. As you heard in the beginning, our listener Sarita recalled a version that referred to a babysitter who was generically on drugs when she accidentally cooked the baby. Sometimes the drug is angel dust, sometimes the drug is even marijuana, but almost always the stupefying substance is lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. In the 1950s, LSD was touted as an exciting psychiatric tool that could potentially treat alcoholism, depression, and PTSD when combined with specialized therapy. At that point, LSD had not yet hit the streets, and it was carefully cultivated by scientists and experimented with by psychologists. Of course, we now know that the CIA was using the drug as part of their MK-Ultra program in order to try to control the minds of foreign enemies, to create a truth serum, and even to develop psychic skills in their subjects. But this was not widely known until 1975.
One of the dramatic characteristics of the psychedelic experience is being with another person and suddenly seeing the ways in which they are like you, not different from you, and experiencing the fact, well, yes, indeed, we are brothers in the true sense of that which is essence in you and which is essence in me is indeed one.
What's this do to the free enterprise market system?
Well, what it does, if I understand it right, is it moves the basic motivation from an achievement competitive to a collaborative kind of enterprise, which means that I'm not working in order to beat you out, but you and I are working in order to both make it.
By the early 60s, Harvard professors like Richard Alpert, who you just heard, and the then infamous Timothy Leary began experimenting with the drug as a form of mind expansion outside the scientific method, creating a great deal of controversy at the university and culminating in the very public firing of both. In 1962, the FDA placed stricter rules on the research around the drug, making the substance harder to get, though not outright illegal, and rogue aficionados outside the academic field began cooking their own forms of LSD in Northern California. By 1965, LSD was seen by the new hippie counterculture as a pathway to expanded consciousness, and even, if used widely enough, world peace. Suddenly, hyper-cool cultural figures like writer Ken Kesey, poet Allen Ginsberg, and musicians like Bob Dylan, the Grateful Dead, and the Beatles expressed their affection for the psychedelic trip, and with the help of these gurus, home-cooked acid spread to hippies all across the country. With all the unregulated LSD being produced and passed out, it's true that bad trips, known then as bummers, were happening with increasing frequency as hippies showed up to the ER blitzed out of their skulls, the streets of Haight-Ashbury full of zombie-like young people acting like astonished, bizarre little children. Paired with the anti-war, anti-racist leftism of campus politics, LSD was seen as a clear and present danger to the morals and sensibilities of American culture. And so, 1966 became the year of the great social and political pushback against LSD, used as a talking point by Ronald Reagan as part of his campaign for California governor.
Well, I'm terribly frightened by the problem with LSD. I think there's been a great deal of misinformation by those who seem to see no harm in it. But as a parent and as a citizen, and certainly now in this position, I am greatly concerned. The misinformation from those who should know better is that it isn't harmful, that it sort of opens up the mind, that we're even seeing some of our young people told it's a worthwhile experiment for them to indulge in this. There is a residual effect that this can come back with what might be permanent brain damage months after even just a single use of it. There is nothing smart, there's nothing grown up or sophisticated in taking an LSD trip at all. They're just being complete fools. Anyone that would engage in this or indulge in this is just a plain fool.
Along with Reagan and other politicians, newspapers, magazines, and television specials began to sound the alarm about the sensational dangers of LSD. Soon, acid scare films were hitting drive-ins with titles like Hallucination Generation, The Trip, and Psych Out.
Don't be a fool, Billy boy. I'm not a junkie. I'm a visionary. A prophet. And I prophesize great things for you if you'll only listen. This contains a glimpse of eternity. Try it, Billy, and you'll see what I mean. All you gotta do is swallow it to taste the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Look what happened to Adam. It won't hurt you. Come on.
With the help of all this anti-LSD messaging, many strange rumors about its effects began to spread. In addition to our hippie babysitter urban legend, there's the one about the young man whose bummer trip left him convinced he was an orange, terrified he may soon be peeled or turned into orange juice. Other versions have the hippie believing that he's a glass of orange juice, afraid that someone will tip him over, which happens to be the version that I heard growing up. In all cases, the young man is affected to this very day, usually locked away in an asylum, the delusion made totally permanent. Of course, no one can say for certain that there haven't been bad trips, or I guess maybe good trips, in which an LSD user envisions themselves as an orange. I imagine that some of us have certainly been rendered that fucking gone by psychedelics at some point during our lives. But the idea that we might stay that way forever is much less believable, that we might be cowering in the corner of a padded room, always moments away from the complete ego death of spilling out our orange liquid soul. This story seemed to be everywhere in 1966, told by speakers in schools educating students about the dangers of drugs, printed in outraged drug-related letters to the editor, and cited as damning evidence in the speeches of emerging experts on LSD.
At times, half of Dr. Ungerleider's patients are recovering from bad trips.
Room, I think you can see the psychedelic art and psychedelic references there on the wall. It's a tremendous problem, not only in Los Angeles, but in all of California, and it's starting to go across the country. Well, a number of different kinds of things happen to the people who take LSD, who have bad experiences. The acute side effects most commonly are hallucinations, meaning auditory and visual. They hear things, they see things that aren't there and that are terrifying. But they're really fooling with dynamite. This is not like swallowing goldfish or the hula hoop or crowding people into a telephone booth. This is really like Russian roulette.
As my obsessive research has shown, it appears that the Orange Man was not an organically appearing urban legend. And in fact, I will not be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this Orange Man never existed. That's because the story's beginning, as far as I can tell, came from two UCLA psychiatric researchers and colleagues, Dr. J. Thomas Ungerleider and Dr. Duke Fisher, who used the anecdote again and again to drive home their point that the positive messaging about the mind-expanding benefits of LSD was ignoring its sometimes frightening potential. The earliest reference I can find to the Orange Man came in October of 1966, when a reporter from the San Francisco Examiner covered a drug education conference presented to 500 teachers and police officials.
A UCLA expert told Here Today how he treated an LSD user who, quote, thought he was an orange, and if anyone touched him, he would turn into orange juice.
The article states that a Dr. Duke Fisher told the audience that the man came to believe he was an orange long after he stopped using LSD in what was known as a flashback, a sudden return to a psychedelic state that could come days, weeks, even years after as little as a single dose, a phenomenon that to this day has little evidence to prove its existence. This angle meant the dangers of the drug could be extended out indefinitely, and any disturbing behavior could be blamed on a random LSD flashback. In fact, our hippie babysitter is sometimes described as having one of these flashbacks when she commits her delusional, brutal crime. The stories told at that conference, with its 500 educators and police officers, were likely spread far and wide as new cautionary tales. The Orange Man anecdote was again repeated 3 months later in January of 1967. In an article printed in the Register out of Santa Ana, California, the reporter details a presentation made by Laguna Beach High School principal Frank Mattis about LSD use among his teenage students. Frank said he had attended that drug education conference 3 months before and spoke about what he had learned.
There's a beautiful UCLA co-ed who just sits in the corner. She thinks she's an orange, and you can't feed her because she's afraid of turning into orange juice.
To that I say, Frank, you need to listen. The next month, in February of 1967, we hear the story repeated again during a drug symposium when Dr. Ungerleider and Dr. Duke used the Orange Man as an example of an uncounted statistic, users who never seek aid.
As far as the question, are there side effects in users in the community who never seek aid? The answer is most assuredly there are. A good example is the fellow who's holed up in his room on LSD. He won't come out, he thinks he's an orange, and that if anybody touches him, he'll turn into orange juice. So the culture supports him, and they bring him his LSD and his food, and he doesn't go on the records as a bad statistic.
Then, in August of 1967, 6 months later, Dr. Ungerleider appeared in the Press Telegram out of Long Beach telling the same story. Quote,
"We have Virgin Marys, we have Jesuses. We have one patient who thinks he is an orange and that he'll squirt juice if touched."
But during an important Senate hearing on LSD that also occurred in August of 1967, Dr. Duke explicitly said that the man was not a patient. Quote,
"He locked himself in his room and refused to leave it for fear that if someone touched him, he'd turn into orange juice. He also refused to let me treat him. This man is totally, and perhaps permanently, psychotic. But like thousands of other poor creatures wandering around in a dazed condition in hippie neighborhoods, his case will never be reported, and he may never be treated. The hippie community brings food to the Orange Man's room, and they look after his basic needs."
So which is it, boys? Which is it? Was he your patient or was he not your patient? Did you treat him or did he refuse treatment? Which is it? The most generous read here would be that the doctors saw him once, perhaps in the ER, and then he left and refused further treatment. But then I found something else that was very interesting in one of the many LSD scare videos that were put out at the time, many of which contained interviews with both Dr. Duke and Dr. Ungerleider. There they were in an episode of a docuseries called The World of Tomorrow that came out in February of 1967. 4 months after the earliest reference made about the Orange Man by Dr. Duke. The special used both doctors as their main authoritative voices, but neither brought up the Orange Man's story, and it was instead brought up by one of their patients, a former user of LSD who was now on camera raising her concerns about the dangerous drug.
Have you noticed any of your friends or people who continue to use LSD? I know that you haven't used it since you left the hospital. But have any of your friends had these kind of changes in themselves?
I've seen people, one friend of mine thought he was an orange for a long time. I haven't seen him since he thought he was an orange, in fact.
What did he do?
He just wouldn't let anyone touch him because he was afraid he was going to turn to orange juice, which, sounds kind of funny, but when someone really believes that they're an orange, it's kind of scary.
And just who do we think she was conversing with on camera at that moment? None other than Dr. Duke Fisher, who does not acknowledge that this Orange Man had been, according to both men, a patient of his and or Dr. Ungerleider. Now, it's possible that our rueful hippie girl simply knew this same man that the doctors had seen briefly who then refused treatment. But I also think it's possible that the doctors heard this weird story from this weird lady and told it firsthand in different ways that suited their narrative over time, not knowing that in 60 years, a snoopy gay amateur folklorist would snort around like a bloodhound, finding discrepancies in their various accounts of their meeting with this Orange Man. Or maybe there was no academic conspiracy to commit this specific slander against LSD. Maybe the Orange Man really did exist, and this was never an urban legend at all. I guess you can decide for yourself, and I tell you to do your own research, but I'm fairly convinced that I have done it all. Anyway, in 1968, Dr. Duke committed his Orange Man to print in a book about drug abuse. This time, he would totally separate himself from any relation to the young man. Quote,
"Some people would take LSD, and their trip would continue beyond the usual 12 to 18 hours for LSD effects. An example of this kind of reaction was a teenage boy who locked himself in his room because he thought he was an orange, and that if someone touched him, he would turn into orange juice."
More after this. And now, back to the show. Whether or not the Orange Man story was fact or fabrication, it contributed in no small part to the idea that LSD could cause a total loss of reality, as was the case with the hippie babysitter's baby roast. But the difference was, the Orange Man harmed no one but himself, and our babysitter, well, by now, you know what she did. Happening at the same time that these tales were forming, a well-publicized true crime story shocked the country, one that seemed to prove that LSD was not just a danger to those consuming it, but also to those coming in contact with the temporarily insane, deranged hallucinator. On April 12, 1966, frightening headlines like these blared all across the country.
LSD involved in New York slaying. High on LSD, he's held as a killer. Medical school dropout held in LSD slaying. LSD flyer held in knife slaying.
The paper said that during his arrest, suspect Stephen Kessler told police, quote, "Man, I've been flying for 3 days on LSD. I'm high. I'm really high." A Wired article detailed exactly what had happened.
A former medical student who told police that he had been under the influence of the hallucinatory drug LSD for the last 2 days was charged yesterday with the murder of his mother-in-law. Police said that when Stephen Kessler, 30, was brought to the Empire Boulevard station house yesterday afternoon for questioning about the fatal slashing earlier in the day of his mother-in-law, Mrs. Florence Cooper, 57, Kessler said, "I've been high on LSD for a couple of days. What am I here for? Did I kill my wife? Did I rape anyone? What have I done? I've been high on LSD."
The articles explain that the victim was stabbed 105 times by Kessler when he showed up looking for his wife, who'd recently moved back in with her parents after asking for a separation. The same article continued.
As Kessler was being booked on first-degree murder charges last night, a reporter called out to him, "Did you do it?" Kessler, who attempted to shield his face from the cameras with a half-eaten salami and cheese sandwich, replied, quote, "I don't know. I don't know whether I did it or not." In response to the routine query from the desk office as to whether he took drugs, Kessler said, "I took LSD once."
When his trial arrived, the LSD angle was used by the defense, who argued that the drug had caused Kessler to experience both a loss of control and total amnesia of the event. The prosecution, on the other hand, presented their evidence that Kessler had believed his mother-in-law had convinced his wife to stay away from him. They also argued that the LSD excuse was something that Kessler had consciously cooked up, mirroring lawyers who had begun using the drug as a way to get their clients off for reasons of temporary insanity. The 11 jurors did in fact elect to find him not guilty by reason of insanity, the judge ordering that he be placed in the custody of the State Mental Hygiene Authority. But it turned out that LSD was not the reason they came to their decision. It was because Kessler had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and hospitalized in the weeks leading up to the murder. He had also been kicked out of medical school 2 years before when his behavior became noticeably unstable. Though witnesses were called to the stand who claimed Stephen told them he had taken a sugar cube dosed with acid the morning before the killing, Stephen himself said he had only taken it a handful of times, the last being a month before the day of the violent act. It turned out that Kessler had actually been drinking a bunch of lab-grade alcohol mixed with water, along with barbiturates and sleeping pills in the 2 days before he killed his mother-in-law, and he had every motive to remove the woman he believed stood in the way of reconciliation with his wife. But many, if not most, newspapers continued to push the more sensationalized version of the story, that it was indeed the LSD that drove him to commit this terrible act while totally unaware of what he was doing, much like our hippie babysitter. After the trial had ended, in an interesting turn of events, Dr. Thomas Ungerleider, one of our 2 psychologists of Orange Man fame, took issue with the way that LSD had been used as an excuse for criminal activity. He wrote a letter to the American Journal of Psychiatry to present his opinion on the wave of LSD alibis, expressing deep skepticism that temporary violent insanity or total amnesia was caused by LSD alone. But it seems that the damage was done as soon as the story hit the papers. Just a week after the first articles about the murder came out, Sandoz, which was the only legal manufacturer of LSD, shut the program down due to the changing laws and the bad publicity, and all FDA-approved studies of the chemical's potential benefits were halted. 1 month after that, both New York and California would criminalize possession of LSD. Almost a year after the verdict hit, the federal government would follow suit, and the frightening reputation of LSD would be solidified in the minds of suburban squares all over the nation. As I always do, I spent a great deal of time on newspapers.com trying to see if there were any other major stories in the early 1960s that could have added a grain of truth to the hippie babysitter. I'm happy to report that there were a surprisingly small number of true babysitter horror stories, and predictably, absolutely none related to a baby being baked in an oven. One of the few stories I found that could have potentially contributed to our legend was a pretty well-publicized news saga that went on for several months in 1964 and 1965. The majority of U.S. states followed the harrowing tale of Stephen Money, a 6-month-old child in St. Petersburg, Florida, who had been placed under the care of a babysitter named Mrs. Gloria Drips. But Mrs. Drips was not an irresponsible teenage girl, as the 60s babysitter archetype suggests. She was instead a married 34-year-old woman and a trusted neighbor to the Money family. The following description of what happened is a little upsetting, so keep that in mind, but I will mention that it appears that little Stephen ended up okay. In late December of 1964, Stephen's young parents, George and Barbara, had a night out of the house, leaving the baby in the care of Mrs. Drips. George arrived home first, around 8 p.m., and when he opened their front door and started to walk inside, Mrs. Drips began screaming that the baby had stopped breathing. George then gave mouth-to-mouth to his son before rushing him to the local hospital, where it was discovered that he had a myriad of injuries, including burns on his feet and one of his hands. When questioned by police, the babysitter claimed no knowledge of what had happened and was immediately stricken with a flu, unable to contribute any more to the investigation. When it was discovered that George's first wife had filed for divorce, citing extreme cruelty, the police turned their suspicion toward the father and arrested him. But a few days later, there was another shocking turn. The state attorney announced that George Money had been cleared of all charges. But why? The newspaper said that Mrs. Drips had recovered from her illness and had finally given police a second interview, telling them that she may have accidentally injured the child while under the influence of drugs. LSD was not the substance she had taken, but instead legally prescribed tranquilizers along with Dexedrine, which she referred to as pep pills. She told police that she believed the drugs had dulled her senses, leading her to burning the baby accidentally with hot bath water that she herself could not feel properly. Police told reporters that, quote, she also admitted to smoking 6 packs of cigarettes a day, dropping individual cigarettes and lighting others continuously, and forgetting where she put the lighted ones. They believed that this also could have resulted in the burns seen on Stephen, and that his other injuries could be explained by Mrs. Drips' confession that she, in her intoxicated state, had at one point fallen on top of the baby. By February, the case was closed by the county prosecutor, and no charges were filed against the babysitter as Stephen's condition continued to improve by the day. The county prosecutor told reporters, quote,
it appears from the investigation that her actions were the result of drugs. It does not appear to be anything deliberate, criminal, or of malicious intent.
Obviously, this story shares many similarities with our urban legend, a drugged-out babysitter who accidentally harms a child, burns one in fact, due to her choice to get too fucked up while babysitting. But in this case, the drugs were legally prescribed, and our babysitter was not a teenage girl. Of course, it's impossible to know if this well-publicized saga contributed to the legend, but it could have certainly added its own little grain of truth. Let's return now to our 1960s babysitter history, as told in one of our main sources, Marion Foreman Brunel's book, Babysitter, An American History. As just one of many similar pieces of childcare-related literature put out by social organizations, the U.S. Children's Bureau published their infant care pamphlet in 1963, which contained quotes from doctors and psychologists that warned parents that they must, quote, hire someone who can be trusted. Experts on children's health told parents to find mentally well-balanced sitters, and even the director of the FBI had publicly stated that parents must only hire reliable teenagers. The concern about these working girls was so great that American corporations attempted to work alongside social service organizations in, quote,
a national campaign to alert the public to the dangers of hiring unprepared and irresponsible babysitters.
Though both PepsiCo and for some reason Union Carbide, a chemical company, requested that the Girl Scouts work with them on such a project, they were beaten to the punch by phone company AT&T. Together with the American Academy of Pediatrics, the National PTA, and the National Safety Council, they created a vocational film called The Babysitter in 1965. In one scene, a mother is attempting to get a hold of the sitter by calling the house, but the sitter's friend is gabbing on the line, preventing the communication. As they are distracted, goofing off, their infant charge is left injured. Despite my grueling efforts to find this film online, I could not. But apparently, at one point, the infant looks up and says, "Some babysitter she'll make." The revolutionary spirit of the 1960s brought messages of feminism and labor rights that reached these teenage babysitters who were tired of the low pay, the extra chores, tired of parents arriving back far later than promised, their ill-behaved children, and sometimes even the advances of the fathers in the home. In response to all the literature about how a babysitter should act, a high school junior named Karen Aspinwall wrote a code of conduct for the parents to follow. The New York Times wrote that this teen had laid down the law in a sort of Fair Employment Practices Act. Comedian Alan King used these unreasonable, ungrateful teenage girls as a punchline in his book called Anybody Who Owns His Own Home Deserves It, claiming that, quote,
getting a babysitter is not as easy as you think. They're all organized. You don't hire a babysitter today. You put in a sealed bid, and then you have to negotiate. When asked if she would like to babysit, she comes right back with, "What do you have to offer?"
Yeah, how dare they want to babysit for anything other than the absolute privilege of the joy of learning responsibility. It seems possible that this pushback against the push for babysitters' rights made the hippie babysitter a more attractive tale because it reinforced the idea that these militant, unionizing babysitters, inspired by the counterculture around them, were not responsible enough to deserve the fair pay that parents did not want to shell out.
LSD-25 has been found by several investigators to cause breakage in human chromosomes. We at least have to begin to become concerned about possible damage to unborn children.
We see teratogenicity. This is a rather big word. It only means that we have abnormal fetuses. We have children that are born without legs or arms, and perhaps one of the most important things is the fact that after genetic damage, we may have a mutagenic event. By this we mean an effect not only for our present generation, but something that is carried over into succeeding generations.
In the midst of all the LSD panic of 1967, the drug took yet another serious PR hit, this time directly related to innocent babies, when newspapers spread alarmist new studies by scientists about the potential genetic damage that LSD-using moms were doing to the unborn. Time magazine explained that preliminary research was showing that LSD caused congenital disabilities. The U.S. News and World Report titled their bombshell article on the subject, "The Truth About LSD is Coming Out, and It is a Tragic Story." The Saturday Evening Post put out their article under the headline, "The Hidden Evils of LSD," that said, quote, "If you take LSD even once, your children may be born malformed." The Washington Post claimed that an infant had been born with, quote, "faulty intestines and a misshapen head," the direct result of the mother's affinity for LSD. In the subsequent years, these studies were proven false, but they were already burned into the public consciousness, further linking infants to the potential horrors of LSD. Now, despite my general dislike of this angle, we may as well look at a more Freudian interpretation of the legend. Unborn babies have been referred to as a bun in the oven for 2,000 years, all the way back to Hippocrates. The fact that the baby in our story was specifically baked in an oven seems like it could have some sort of meaning that would appeal to the unconscious mind. The baby is killed by the metaphorical mother's womb, the safe place that once protected it. But now that safe womb is out taking in a show or working late, abandoning the baby to a teenage stranger. When we look back to the folklore of fairy tales, we can find stories of child neglect by parents, as told in Hansel and Gretel, abandoned in the woods by their father and evil stepmother in a more literal version of the abandonment of the child with Babysitter. The pair of German siblings are almost baked in the primitive oven of a witch, the archetypal woman who shirked her duty as a Christian mother. In our urban legend today, the witch is the dangerous Bobby Soxer, the hippie babysitter, a proto-feminist driven mad by the drugs that make her commit the ultimate act of evil in a suburban era gas oven. There's one last thing that kept popping into my head over the course of making this episode. Our urban legend today feels similar to the slanderous boogeyman tales that crop up again and again over centuries about a certain outgroup of the population sacrificing the babies of the dominant culture in some kind of evil ritual. Stories that help paint the enemy as inhuman, immoral, and thus justify any attacks against them. Soon, the extremely sensationalized tale of the Manson family would reinforce this idea. Under the influence of a criminal guru, a bedraggled group of young hippie girls on a perpetual LSD trip committed unfathomably brutal murders, including the killing of an unborn baby, originally reported on by the media as a satanic-esque hippie ritual. By the next year, the Nixon administration classified LSD as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act, and by 1971, he increased federal funding for drug control agencies as he declared his destructive war on drugs against what he called Public Enemy Number 1. Between 1970 and 1972, we start to see newspapers writing about the baby roast urban legend in order to debunk the rumor's apparent swell in states like New York, California, Utah, and Wisconsin. This and many other pieces of acid lore helped influence popular opinion and political policies, which were used to weaken the leftist movements that defined the generation. I think our hippie babysitter, in a way, was a metaphor for the distrust of the youth and their rejection of the established order, a savory human sacrifice of America's suburban baby to the dangerous girl power of the psychedelic New Age gods. This was American Hysteria. If you want to support our show, and the truth is, we need your support now more than ever, you can go to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get ad-free episodes as well as bonus content, like the podcast that I make with our producer Miranda called Hysteria Home Companion, where we tell you stories related to the topics that we're covering or just stories we know that you'll love. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. Anything helps. You can also go to AmericanHysteria.com and leave us a message on our Urban Legends Hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up or one that you've heard recently, and we might do an entire investigation about it like we did for this episode. That's AmericanHysteria.com. Another great way to help out our show is to leave us a 5-star review on the app of your choosing and to follow us on Instagram at American Hysteria Podcast. American Hysteria is written, produced, and hosted by me, Chelsey Weber-Smith. Our producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer and sound designer is Riley Swedelius Smith, and our voice actor is Will Rogers. Thanks, as always, for listening. And despite everything that we've talked about in this episode, I encourage you not to do acid before you babysit. Have a great